This webinar is designed to assist a school chairperson in the recruitment of a principal teacher. For all other school staff appointments, both the chairperson and principal are members of the interview board. However, as the outgoing principal has no role to play in the recruitment of his or her successor, this webinar sets out the steps that a chairperson is required to take to ensure that the recruitment procedures set out in Chapter 4 of Circular 44/2019 are applied in an open, fair and impartial manner. The recruitment procedure for the appointment of school principal provides for interviewing using digital technology. However, as the majority of dioceses require such senior management positions to be filled using face-to-face interviews, this webinar will focus on that particular method of interview. The webinar was recorded on the 15th of May 2022, and it is based on the procedures and circulars that were operational on that date. Chapter 4 of Circular 44/2019 sets out the procedures for the appointment of principal and deputy principal through open competition, but for the purposes of this presentation, we will focus on the appointment of school principal. The responsibility of the Board of Management is to ensure that the process is compliant with these procedures and with relevant legislation and circulars. The second document on your screen is Looking at Our School 2016, a quality framework for primary schools. This quality framework covers two dimensions, teaching and learning, and leadership and management. The relevant section for the appointment of principal is leadership and management, and we'll have a further look at the four domains in this section as they are used both in the assessment of applications and also as the assessment criteria for interview. A hard copy of the CPSMA publication, A Guide for Chairpersons of Boards of Management of Catholic Schools, was issued to all schools in spring 2020. This is a very useful resource for chairpersons and is designed to assist you in the many and varied aspects of your role. It can also be accessed on the CPSMA website and on the CPSMA app, and we'll make reference to the handbook in the course of this presentation. There is a suite of additional documents available on the CPSMA website, which will help you at each stage of the recruitment process. The first is a checklist which lists the actions that need to be taken at each of these listed stages. Administration in preparation for interview, administration for shortlisting, interviews, and post-interview administration. In addition, under the appointment section of cpsma.ie, you will find a template letter of invitation to interview, a template letter to the Board of Management setting out that the procedures have been followed and that references have been secured in respect of the highest ranking candidate, a guidance on productive questioning at interview, a checklist for the retention of documents for the successful candidate. These documents will be retained on the personnel file for the duration of the principal's employment plus 7 years. The vacancy is confirmed when the notice of retirement or resignation of the outgoing principal is submitted to the board, accepted, and entered into correspondence. Establish the starting date of the appointment based on the notice period that is given. This could be at the beginning of the school year, after October midterm, after the Easter holidays, etc. Contact your patron to advise of the vacancy. This is normally notified through your diocesan secretary. At this point, your patron or diocesan secretary is likely to advise you of the 2 independent assessors nominated by the patron to conduct the interview process with you. If the 2 independent assessors are not nominated by the patron, then the interview board will not be properly constituted. What are the needs and priorities of your school? The needs will be determined by a number of factors. For example, the size of school. Is it a teaching principal position or administrative principal? The designation of the school. Is it a special school? Is it a school with DESH status? Are there particular whole school evaluation recommendations to be implemented? Is there a change in demographics leading to either an increase or decrease in numbers? Or are there other factors? This discussion will be held at board level, and you, as chairperson, will bring that information to the shortlisting meeting, so that the two independent assessors will be aware of the specific competencies and skills required to fulfill this particular leadership role. The board may decide that experience as a serving principal would be considered beneficial when considering applications under the 4 leadership competencies. But remember, the application forms must give relevant examples of where the candidates demonstrated that capacity. The board may also decide whether a minimum number of applications is required for the competition to proceed. Vacancies must be advertised on at least one of the websites approved by the management bodies and should be notified to all teaching staff in the school, including teaching staff on approved leave, for example, maternity leave or career break, etc. Educationpost.ie and staffroom.ie are 2 approved websites. This screenshot shows the opening page for placing an advertisement on educationpost.ie. You can see that the required fields are clearly set out and a drop-down menu is provided to assist in completing the advertisement. Please note that only one email address should be included in the advertisement. If you are inviting applications by email, you should set up a separate email for the application process and do not use the school email address. However, if you are inviting applications by post only, you can include the regular school email address for information purposes. You can check with the outgoing principal or perhaps the school secretary regarding any account that the school has with any of these websites, so that you can use the same login details for the purpose of placing the advertisement. Vacancies for school principals should not be advertised in July or August, except in exceptional circumstances and with the prior approval of the patron. Always retain a copy of the advertisement, as this will be required for the shortlisting meeting and will also be retained with other documentation relating to the appointment. The advertisement should invite applications from eligible teachers to be submitted to the chairperson of the Board of Management. The procedures state at 7.3 that there shall be no unreasonable delay between the notification of the vacancy, insertion of the advertisement, and the filling of the post. The vacancy should be advertised on the website for 14 days. The closing date and time for receipt of completed applications should not be earlier than 14 days after the first date of publication. At least 7 days' notice of a specific interview date and time should be given to candidates who are shortlisted for interview. The notice period should be after the closing date and the interview time should be outside of school hours. Just a note in relation to a temporary change that was introduced to expedite recruitment during the pandemic. For the 2021-2022 school year, the advertisement period was reduced to 7 days and the interview notification period was reduced to 5 days. There is no indication that this provision will apply going forward, so it's best to adhere to the timeframes that are set out in this slide. The circular sets out the eligibility criteria for 4 different types of school settings: primary schools with less than 80 pupils, primary schools with 80 pupils or more, special schools, and special schools with pupils up to the age of 18 years. Whether you have requested a CV or a standard application form, and by the way, you cannot request both, you and the 2 independent assessors will be able to determine whether or not an applicant is eligible for appointment. If there are no eligible applicants, or if the minimum number of applications is not received, the position can be re-advertised. Original applicants need not reapply, as their applications will be retained until the next closing date. A certificate to teach Catholic religious education should also be requested at the advertising stage. To ensure that the candidate is appropriately qualified in this regard, you should refer to the document on screen, which sets out the Irish Episcopal Conference policy, or you can check with your diocesan secretary. Contact the diocesan secretary or patron's office in good time to ensure that the 2 independent assessors are appointed and available for the recruitment timeline. The independent assessors are independent of the Board of Management and represent the patron in respect of compliance with the procedures. They will have experience of the recruitment process and will assist you in discharging your duties as chairperson of the interview board. At least one member of the interview board should be a female and at least one member a male. Arrange a shortlisting meeting to be held as soon as practicable after the closing date. A date for interviews could also be discussed at this point and finalised at the shortlisting meeting. Applications are invited by post or email, and under the recruitment procedure set out in Chapter 4 of Circular 44/2019, the selection process is exactly the same for both. That is, the applications shall be opened in the presence of the interview board. At the shortlisting meeting, check, if specified, has the minimum number of applications been received? Advise both independent assessors of the needs and priorities of the school. Open the applications. Disclosures of interest should be declared at this point. Interview members are required to make a disclosure not only in the case of a family relationship, but in respect of any relationship which could be regarded as prejudicial to ensuring absolute impartiality in the selection process. Establish eligibility in the first instance, and then proceed to select the applicants for interview. Once eligibility is established, the criteria are applied to the applications, and the application of the criteria should reflect the needs and priorities of the school. The criteria are leading teaching and learning, managing the organisation, leading school development, and developing leadership capacity. By requesting a standard application form to be completed for these appointments, the candidate is expected to provide evidence of their competence and/or achievements under each of these 4 leadership domains or criteria. The form states the following. Under each competency heading, please describe some of your personal achievements that demonstrate the necessary skills and qualities required for the position of school principal. Please illustrate with examples. So it's up to every candidate to use this opportunity to set out their stall, so to speak. The same criteria are used for shortlisting and for interview and carry equal marks. In the Looking at Our School 2016 document, which was referenced at the start of the presentation, you will find greater detail on the competencies that are required under each of these domains, and you'll find that in pages 21 to 28 of the document. The independent assessors appointed by the patron will have training and experience in applying these criteria. Boards of management are statutorily obliged to uphold the characteristic spirit of the school on behalf of the patron. We've already referenced the required certification for the teaching of religious education in Catholic schools. Domain 3, Leading School Development, lists the communication of the guiding vision for the school and the leading of its realisation as a leadership standard. In terms of assessing the applications, you have an obligation to the patron to explore the candidate's understanding of the ethos of Catholic school, and this will be evaluated further at interview stage. When it comes to the interview stage, interview questions should look for evidence of how a candidate would uphold the ethos of the school, rather than endeavouring to ascertain a candidate's general religious outlook. In the CPSMA Guide for Chairpersons of Boards of Management of Catholic Schools, Appendix 12, and you'll get that, as I said earlier, on the CPSMA app, we offer guidance on the type of question that you could use to elicit the evidence of commitment to the Catholic ethos. But remember, no 2 Catholic schools are exactly the same, and the questions asked at interview should be based on the vision, needs, priorities, and context of the school in question. It is good practice to make a brief note of the shortlisting meeting. There is a template letter of invitation to interview on the CPSMA website. The schedule for Catholic primary schools should be enclosed with the invitation, and this can also be downloaded from the CPSMA website. Agree a set of questions to be asked based on the 4 assessment criteria. Remind all members of the interview board of the requirement for confidentiality throughout the process. When devising questions for interview, remind them of the absolute requirement to be mindful of equality legislation and that questions posed should not indicate any intention to discriminate on any of the 9 grounds set out in legislation. Finally, it would be useful to discuss marking and note-taking at this point, with a follow-up discussion just before the interviews begin. Remember that notes and marking sheets may be requested under data protection. Notes should serve as an aide-memoire in respect of responses given and evidence of competency. Subjective comments should be avoided. The interview board will need these notes as a reminder of the evidence of competency given in the course of the interview, and marks will not be awarded until the final candidate has been interviewed. When recording the minutes of the shortlisting meeting, note the venue, the date, the start time and finishing time, the names of attendees, that is, the members of the interview board, the number of applications received, whether the applications were by post or email, declarations of conflict of interest and the action taken, if any, the number of eligible applications, the number of candidates shortlisted for interview, the agreed date of interview, and the date by which the letters of invitation are to be sent. Meet in good time to review what has been previously discussed at the shortlisting meeting. The venue for interviews should be comfortable and appropriately furnished for a meeting between a group of adults, and should include a comfortable waiting area. The interview board should, as far as practicable, ensure that while in the interview venue, candidates do not meet each other either prior to or after the interview. Ensure that the person who is meeting the candidates is fully briefed on their role, that is, that they will welcome the candidate and escort him or her to the waiting area, where they will wait until called. When scheduling the interviews, allow sufficient time for each interview and provide each candidate with the same amount of time, and do not schedule too many in one day. Documentation required for each member of the interview board will include the advertisement, the criteria for the post, that is, the 4 leadership and management domains, a copy of the eligibility criteria for the school in question, the applicant's letters, CVs or application forms, requested documentation, etc. as appropriate, a marking sheet for each interviewee with equal weighting for each criterion, a list of the agreed questions, a timetable, and finally the chairperson will need the aggregate template for completion when all of the individual marking sheets have been filled in. Here we have an example of an individual marking sheet for the recruitment of a principal. There should be no deviation from the marking scheme of 4 domains with 25 marks each. For example, you cannot add a criterion to allocate marks for performance at interview. How a candidate performs at interview will inform the marks awarded for each of the 4 domains. The aggregated sheet will be completed by the chairperson. You can see from this example that the assessors are noted as assessors 1, 2, and 3. In this example, we have redacted the scores of 3 of the candidates to demonstrate how to respond to the request for an individual's marks. In this instance, John Smith has requested his marks and he's not entitled to the marks of any other candidate. As chairperson, your role is to welcome the candidate, introduce the panel to the candidate, and explain the role of the 2 independent assessors appointed by the patron. Steer the interview. Introduce the relevant assessor who is going to ask the agreed questions. Ensure that all members avoid any bias or discrimination. Follow up with supplementary questions, if required, on points which need clarification after other interview board members have finished. When leading the interview to a close, give the candidate an opportunity to ask questions and fill in any remaining gaps. Advise the candidate of the next steps and give them some indication of when they might hear from the board. Ensure that the documentation is retained. Again, just a reminder that documentation in respect of unsuccessful candidates is retained for 18 months, then shredded, and for the successful candidate, it will be retained for the duration of their employment plus 7 years. Checking references of the successful candidate is obligatory, and it's recommended that the references are checked by the chairperson in the presence of the interview board before they disperse. It's advisable to construct a set of questions around the job specification and the competencies you're looking for, and ask the referee to respond. Confirmation of receipt of suitable references, either verbal or written, for the highest ranked candidate must be included in the written report to the Board of Management. And as referenced earlier, there's a template report to the board on the CPSMA website. Just a reminder that the responsibility for the recruitment procedure is delegated by the Board of Management to the interview board. So once the above report or declaration is presented to the Board of Management, then the appointment must be sanctioned. The Board of Management is required to offer the post to the highest ranked applicant nominated for appointment, unless it has good and sufficient reason not to do so, and this reason was not known to the interview board. If this happens, the matter should be referred to the patron, whose decision in the matter will be accepted by the Board of Management. Patron approval must be secured before the position is offered, and the letter of offer is subject to the terms set out in relevant circulars, and this includes the vetting circular. Other candidates are notified once the successful candidate has accepted the post in writing. A template contract for principal is available on the CPSMA website. A primary teacher's appointment and reappointment form must be completed and submitted to primary teacher's payroll section. Use the CPSMA document checklist to ensure that the necessary documents are retained. Update the seniority list. A principal teacher is always the most senior teacher in the school, irrespective of any service given in that school. And finally, a summary of some do's. Follow the agreed procedures. Advertise all positions in a non-discriminatory manner. Ensure reasonable accommodation to facilitate a candidate with a disability. Have gender balance on the interview panel. Draft standard interview questions in advance. Take objective notes of the interviews, and treat all candidates equally. And a summary of some don'ts. Don't ask anything that may lead to an inference of discrimination on any of the 9 grounds. Don't query family or marital status or childcare arrangements. Don't deviate from the approved standard type of interview questions, and don't depart from the agreed procedures. That concludes our webinar on appointing a school principal. We hope that it will be of assistance to you. Please remember that our education advisors are available at any stage from 9 a.m. to 5 p.m. weekdays to answer any further specific queries at 01 62 92 462 or email info@cpsma.ie. Please do not hesitate to contact us with any query that you might have, however simple or complex. It's really important that CPSMA has the correct and up-to-date contact details for chairpersons and principals, and particularly the details of any newly appointed principals. So please make contact with the office either by email or telephone to ensure that we have the most up-to-date contact information on our system. Slán go fóill.